Hi guys. So today we are going to do chapter 11, which is auditing the purchasing process. So this is sort of the second chapter where we're auditing various processes that happen in the company, right? Chapter 10 is auditing revenues. Chapter 11 is auditing purchasing. And then chapter 16 is the last chapter kind of this ilk that we're going to be doing, and it is auditing the cash investment process. All right, so similar to chapter 10, we're first going to be talking about different types of documents in the purchasing process. Then we'll quickly kind of talk about some inherent risk factors related to this process too. And then we'll talk about test of controls, different types of controls in purchasing. And then we'll talk about how to substantively test the purchasing process and substantively test AP. Remember, the purchasing process is going to start with a purchase requisition, which will be generated by a user department. And then they will send that purchase requisition to the actual purchasing department, and they will generate a PO, which will be sent out to a vendor. So the purchase requisition, when we say user department, that means any department in an organization. So for instance, like the accounting department could say, hey, we need more calculators or whatever. And so they will fill out a purchase requisition that they then send in to the purchasing department, right? So they send this to purchasing department. And then the purchasing department prepares this PO. And then the PO gets sent out to the vendor. So it can go kind of external to the firm. So the purchasing requisition, in contrast, is just an internal document. Once it gets sent out to the vendor, then basically on the vendor side, we see the sales process happening, right? So that was kind of chapter 10. From the vendor's perspective, they turn that purchase order into a customer order, right? And they're going to go through the process of shipping the goods out and invoicing the customer and so on and so forth. So the vendor ships the goods out, and then they're eventually going to be received by the purchaser, which today we're from the purchaser's perspective. So when they're received by the purchaser, they are going to fill out a receiving report. And so the receiving report will be filled out basically by the people actually in the warehouse or, receiving dock area, and when the goods are actually received. So when I say that, I mean the receiving report is typically, it's not like filled out by somebody in the accounting department later. When they fill this out, that should trigger a liability to be recorded, right? Because it'll say, okay, so we debit inventory and we credit AP, something like that. Then somebody will validate in the purchasing department. They will sit and they will wait to receive an invoice from the vendor, right? And so they'll wait until the vendor invoices them. And when the vendor invoices them, they are going to match that vendor invoice up with the receiving report. And then they'll know it's okay to pay the vendor, right? They'll match the vendor invoice up with the receiving report and the original purchase order and purchase requisition. And they'll say, all right, it's okay to pay these people. So we can, at this point, cut a check to the vendor. And then we can relieve AP and credit cash, right? So this is just reminding you of the various stages in the process. So there's an accounts involved, right? So we have the actual purchase itself, then the cash disbursement that occurs, and then you could feasibly also have purchase returns, although they will be relatively rare. Okay, and these are all your types of documents in the process. And remember, it is, important to understand what these things are, because the names of these documents will show up in the language of the controls, right? So later on, you learn about the various risks in the process and the various controls that address those risks. And they use language like purchase requisition, PO, voucher. And if you don't know what those things are, it becomes really difficult to understand what the control is saying. So that's why we need kind of this baseline of just understanding what these documents are. So the purchase requisition, we said, is just the request to purchase the goods or services, and that's coming from the user department. The purchase order is similar to a purchase requisition, but it is coming from the purchasing department. It'll include the description, quantity, and quality of goods, right? And then they are going to be sending the PO actually out to the vendor, external to the firm. Then the receiving port will document the receipt of goods. And then the vendor invoice is just the bill from the vendor. So in the sales process, we talked about the invoice too. And this is another good check. If you see just the word invoice in a control language or a risk, it's a pretty good indication that you're reading about the sales process, or you're reading about the control in the sales process. Whereas if you see the whole term vendor invoice, it's a pretty good indication that you are reading something going on in the purchasing process. And then we have the voucher, which is the basis for recording a vendor's invoice. And more commonly, this was always called a voucher packet, because essentially what the voucher packet was, it was a kind of collection of documents that said, hey, it's okay for us to pay this vendor. So it would include the vendor invoice, the receiving report, the purchase order, right? All these things that validate the fact that we are supposed to pay this person. And it will also include what the journal entry should be. So, hey, these are the accounts that we should be recording this invoice to. So it will say, indicate, is this an inventory purchase or a supplies purchase, so on and so forth. And then we have all these subledgers here, right? So we have the purchases journal or the voucher register, right? So we're going to record the purchases there. Then the AP subledger, and then also remember the cash disbursements journal or check register will be our subledger to record the cash going out. And then lastly, we have the vendor statement. So this is just on the purchasing side. This is very similar to the customer statement, right? In the sales process, we have the customer statement, which is like we send out every month the statement to our customers showing the purchases, returns, credit memos. And now that we're on the purchasing side, we are receiving from the vendor a similar statement showing our purchase activity, any returns we might have made, any payments we might have made, etc. And then lastly, check or EFT, electronic funds transfer, will be how I pay for my goods and services. One last thing I want to point out here with the voucher, we have the voucher or voucher packet is the basis for recording the vendor's invoice. Note that this is distinct from vouching. So we have voucher versus vouching or vouch. So voucher is the noun. It is this document in the purchasing process. Vouching or vouch is typically the test of existence. It is a verb. So just keep that in mind. And you can technically vouch a voucher, So just pay attention when you're reading a question, pay attention to the exact term being used and the sentence structure and the part of speech. So the functions in the purchasing process are going to be the original purchase requisition, then is going to be put into place, then the actual purchase will occur, the goods will be received, that vendor invoice will be processed, then payment will be dispersed, and everything should be recorded. Once the payment is dispersed, AP should be relieved. Right? AP should be debited once the payment is dispersed, and everything should be recorded in the GL along the way.